Traditional religious frameworks have been losing influence in many Western societies. So what is filling that void? Many say it's social justice movements, that they offer an alternative to help people find meaning in their lives. I'm Mohammed Hassan, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
I don't start from the supposition that human beings are naturally good. I start from the supposition that human beings are going to surround themselves with their own kind if they can, and it is a minor miracle if we get anything like toleration or pluralism.
But I think broadly speaking, if you decenter Christianity from the conversation, you see that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, but also globally in many ways. That I think it's critical for the world to sort of unlock seeing itself in the mirror opposite image of the West.
But we've never tried a basic thing called for by your understanding of original sin. Repent. Where is the repentance of America? Where is the acknowledgement that what we have done is wrong and we must do something to correct what we've done?
Our question today: has social justice become the new religion of the West? I'd like to introduce our guests. Joshua Mitchell is a professor of political theory at Georgetown University. Khaled Baidoun is a professor of law at Arizona State University. And Michael Eric Dyson is a distinguished university professor of African American and diaspora studies at Vanderbilt. A very warm welcome to the three of you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
We're all near Detroit or in its environs, so we feel at home.
So that's what we figured out, is that the three of you have that in common. You all grew up in Detroit, or you have some kind of connection to Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
So I hope you bring that, that
Detroit
sense of
energy.
generosity to this
We're going to agree
debate.
too much. I'm sorry. It's over.
I highly doubt that, because
Yeah,
this
yes.
is an interesting provocation, because it taps into a lot of very personal things: identity, religion, morality. And at the same time, I would like you to disagree, and I would like you to really put your stake in the ground of where you stand on these issues, issues that relate very much to our modern moment, whether it's justice, whether it's social movements, whether it's the decline of religion in the West. And you might even want to challenge that notion. Is religion declining in the West? Joshua Mitchell, can I have you start by answering this question? Has social justice become a new religion in the West?
Well, the term social justice covers a lot of area. I'm more familiar and more comfortable with the term identity politics, and I'd be curious whether gentlemen around the table also agree. But half my training is officially in political science, but I did half my work in divinity school, and so I've been paying very close attention to the deepest longings, I think, of social justice and of identity politics. And I think the deepest longing on the left, and this is where conservatives, I think, don't get it, is a longing for cleanliness, a longing for purity, and that is a religious impulse. And in fact, the term innocent victimhood, which I think is central to the analysis of social justice and identity politics, in fact, emerges out of Christianity. It's a central Christian category. So my view is, with the collapse of Christendom, you don't get secular world. What you get is what Tocqueville called incomplete religions. And I think the French Revolution was the first one. Marxism was the second one. You could say post-colonialism is a third one, with the colonizer colonized. And I think identity politics is attempting to find the answer to the question of purity and stain. That's why conservatives, and I speak mostly conservative circles, I keep telling them, what you don't understand is that the left does grasp that the central question of life is a religious question, either understood, transformed as social justice, or as the religious longing for cleanliness. And I don't think the right understands that. But I think the left doesn't understand that this really is a kind of, call it an incomplete religion. That's Tocqueville's phrase. And I think that's where we are.
So why do you choose to use the language of religion to describe what many young people would see as a fight for morality or a fight for social justice?
But I think, to come back to my observation about cleanliness and purity, the innocent victim category is the central category of Christianity. And I think what's happened is that when the mainline churches collapsed in America and in northwestern Europe, I think a younger generation was looking for a way to think through cleanliness and purity. And I think identity politics has come along to provide exactly that. So when people say we're not religious anymore, I say you're asking the wrong question, you're looking in the wrong place. Because I think right now we're in what I call the Great Awakening around the world, and it's an awakening unto purity and stain. But it's without God and without forgiveness. So I think it's an incomplete version, as was Marxism, as was the French Revolution. So I think there's a several hundred-year development here, and this is the latest iteration.
Now, Michael, if I can bring you in here, you are somebody that not only grapples in your scholarship with issues of identity and issues of justice, but also you are an ordained minister. So how do you see these two things side by side, social justice and religion?
Yeah, well, I think Joshua's presented a very vigorous and engaging kind of genealogy, if you will, both in the sense of Nietzsche and Foucault, about a very explicit expression of identity and how it has been shaped by circumstances and how religion has played a role. I happen to think that identity politics is intriguing, but misnamed, in the sense that there's no identity more aggressive, vigorous, vile, or violent than the conception of whiteness as the backdrop against which so much is unfolded. If we want to do a kind of specific genealogy in the West, you know, in terms of colonialism, in terms of enslavement, in terms of projecting a white identity as a neutral and objective arbiter of competing and rival identities in the marketplace. So everybody else gets to be called an identity, except the major identity itself is never called to account and called on the carpet of responsibility. I think Joshua's point about innocence is powerful, but think about another former Christian, James Baldwin, who talked about white innocence as a way of absorbing the contact of a dominant culture and coming out yourself innocent, not holding yourself accountable. I think Joshua was very powerful there, but in terms of innocence and purity and stain, I think about purity and danger anthropologically there. But what's interesting is that I've seen among, say, African-American people, that's the church that I come out of, an African-American Baptist church, there is tremendous self-recognition that not my mother, not my father, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. So there's a recognition that we are complicit in these very forms, and not only in terms of identity, but the question of evil, right? Whether it's Arendt's, banality of evil, or whether it's Ernest Becker's notion of escape from evil, that you shift from God to humankind, from theodicy to anthropodicy. You got to come up with, what did men do? What did human beings do to create the circumstances and conditions? Religion does provide an answer, but I don't think that seeing social justice as merely a compensatory or rival religious formation is quite exhaustive of what we see going on there. The quest for purity and against stain may be one, but I think also the quest for justice in a fundamental way is very motivating and powerful as well.
What about this idea that there has been a decline of religiosity in the West? Do you even agree with that statement? Do you think it's true? And if so, has there been a void left in its place?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Baptist preacher, so I'm preaching a lot on Sundays. so I hope it ain't no decline.
Are your congregations growing, or are they depleting?
You know what? The love offering is pretty steady and it's great. But the thing is, of course, I think, we can talk about, Joshua's point about the decline of religion, and we can say certainly in terms of mainline religious formations, there's certainly been an erosion and a decline. But there's also been a concomitant rise and resurgence in some religious circles. I can speak about the African-American one. I don't know what's happening in Islam and among Muslim brothers and sisters, but I can tell you that there has been a kind of recrudescence, a kind of resurgence of religious belief, but a spirituality, right? And I know Joshua talks about, spirituality in a very powerful way. I think, spirituality makes religion behave right. So if religion is ligare, to bind together, the formal institutional matrix that receives the spiritual impulse may be on the decline, but the impulse towards spirituality, I think, continues to be a very powerful and vigorous one. Hence, Joshua's point about certain elements of social justice being connected to notions of identity and notions of religion as well.
Now, Khaled, you're somebody that, aside from being a teacher of law, you are somebody that is very upfront and center, not only about your identity as a Muslim, but also about your place as an activist. What do you say to this, to the idea that this identity politics or social justice movements have become this placeholder for something that we've lost in our society?
Well, two things. I think that there's an unfair ascription of identity politics to the left, and specifically to critical race theory and wokeism and whatever term you want to use that is, I think myopic, because there's an identity politics that is, I think, more sinister, as, Michael has stated, and I think a lot more has a deeper rooted history in this country, specifically tied to whiteness and tied to the weaponization of Christianity to advance whiteness. But I think that, so it's important to reframe what we mean by identity politics as not only being caricatured and ascribed to the left in ways that have been destructive for the last, 4 to 6 years, specifically in the United States, but even more broadly. I think that I would frame that social justice is a emergent form of neo-religion or incomplete religion, whatever the framing is. It is filling a lot of voids, right? I think that there is, I've read a lot of research that demonstrates traditional Christian religious observance is declining in the United States, right? And that's juxtaposed with the rise of specific other religions. Islam, for instance, is the fastest growing religion in the United States. Catholicism is also rising in many segments, specifically the Latinx community. So there's some sort of other patterns that complicate the situation. But with social justice, I think it is filling a void, largely speaking, with younger segments, predominantly white Americans, who are not steeped in organized religion and Christianity specifically, and are yearning for and searching for a range of things, right? First, community. There's a lack of community, which is also being intensified with the rise of social media, right? That's exacerbating individualism, being disconnected from real people. Second is, especially on the left, I think this is where I'd agree that on the left there's a nebulousness tied to identity, specifically with younger white folks, because whiteness is stigmatized and derided within leftist spaces. So, adopting a leftist or radical or progressive identity sort of fills that void in ways that, makes them more palatable, for instance, in specific communities. Third, I think that there's a really, frightening development with regard to dogma, right? I wouldn't call it religion necessarily, but zeal and dogma, and sort of subscribing to specific ideologies in ways that are not untrained and not well thought out, that is taking place. So there are some, I would say symptoms of the way we think about organized religion that are taking place, in social justice spaces on the left, but also on the right, right? So for instance, if you look at the followings of people like Nick Fuentes or Candace Owens or Nick Carlson, there's similar patterns of zeal, dogma, but also reverence of these figures as almost being quasi, religious icons in some regards, right? So I think that it's important to broaden the conversation to think about this development of neo-religion as not being just sort of taking place only in the left. It's taking place on the right as well.
That's really fascinating, Joshua. Yeah, what do you think?
So I started writing about this a while ago. So again, I am right of center, though I call myself a liberal, and we could talk about that. I think it's a threefold division. I don't think it's liberal versus conservative. I think it's liberal, conservative, and left. And I'm still a liberal. So I'm very worried about what's happening on the right. It's the alt-right, and I mean this in a very precise way, because this does trace itself to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's view was Christianity had exhausted itself. You have this extraordinary burden of guilt and no way to discharge it, and that's why the West was slowly dying. He wrote about this in the 1880s. And so his proposal is, in order to have a tomorrow, that's his exact formulation, we have to forget. And what that means is we're going to forget slavery in America. We're going to forget colonialism in Europe. We're going to forget 2 world wars. We're going to forget the Holocaust. We just don't care anymore. And that is the attitude. I don't know Nick Fuentes. I've never talked with him, and I don't follow him, but I've heard enough about him. So, but I think that is the attitude of the alt-right, and I think that's
Yeah.
a very, very dangerous development. Let me say something about what Michael raised, because I think it's something worth.
Can I
thinking-
respond to that too? But
Sure. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, go for it, Ben.
Yeah, I
Make your
think,
point
but,
and
but
then-
I wouldn't sort of like, ascribe this ahistoricism only to the alt-right. This has been sort of a fixation of the traditional right for a long time. And you see this specifically with the ways in which the traditional right has eroded and undermined, a range of policies that have been enacted to redress the inequalities and segregation that have been doled out against communities of color. I mean, affirmative action comes to mind, right? The erosion of affirmative action and forgetting about, segregation, Jim Crow, slavery, chattel slavery, colonialism. That isn't an innovation or a contribution of the alt-right. This has been a protracted plan of the traditional right that's been taking place for a long time. So ahistoricism is not unique to the alt-right by any stretch.
But there's something new going on. I mean, just follow the debates on the right. We can talk about all the things that you identified, and I'm happy to do that. But something new is happening. You've got a new generation that is completely unhinged from any sense of moral center. And there's a lot of things that say, I'll go back to Reagan. There's a lot of things that the Reagan Conservative Party has to answer for in terms of undermining communities, shipping jobs overseas. This is the great catastrophe of America from the late 19th century or late 20th century. But I do think something new is happening here. This infatuation with Nietzsche. Look, I grew up in Ann Arbor on the left, University of Michigan. Slowly but surely, I do move toward the center. But I never encountered anything like the Nick Fuentes. The John Birch Society was driven out of the conservative movement. Were there racists in there? Of course. I don't start from the supposition that human beings are naturally good. I start from the supposition that human beings are going to surround themselves with their own kind if they can, and it is a minor miracle if we get anything like toleration or pluralism. Let me come back to what you were saying. Look, the reason why, I'll speak positively about identity politics. The reason why it emerged was because of the failure of the American pluralistic model. Madison says, there are all these differences, they'll compete, everything's going to be fine. And it collapsed because of the civil rights crisis, and it collapsed because of women's rights. And that's why? Because presumably under pluralism, everybody's visible, but two groups weren't. And so what happens is you get the attempt to render visible those who had been invisible. And the central mythos of Christianity, and I don't mean falsehood, the central story is that here's a person who everybody thought was guilty, but in fact turned out to be innocent. And so identity politics reveals that the person who's been made invisible should be visible. And that to me is a tremendous advance. The problem, in my view, is that the way it does this is that it makes everybody a representative of a particular group. So there's whiteness, there's blackness, there's these different groups that are effectively essential. And so you can't be a black conservative. You can't be you can't be a woman who wants to be traditional. The desire to make people
According to who?
visible. I'm saying Clarence Thomas, Glenn Lowry, Bob Woodson. I mean, I go right down the list of black conservatives who are literally invisible because they don't want to adhere to the identity politics victimhood narrative.
But look, it's a fascinating, getting rid of Nietzsche on the one hand and Sullivan back in terms of genealogy is a brilliant move. And look, the second essay on the genealogy of morals about that forgetting is devastating. But I think about Gore Vidal, who talked about living in the United States of amnesia. So that there's one thing to forget, to be made to forget, and to erase, to eviscerate, and to not remember. The gesture of not remembering, the point you're making in terms of, say, women's rights or African Americans or, anti-Muslim and so on, the truth is that there is one particular identity that is a master signifier, so to speak. And that identity is a whiteness that never has to own up to itself. So when you say, there's whiteness and blackness, there was never whiteness and blackness and brown and the like until whiteness was challenged. Whiteness was presumed to be universal, so that even the quest for a
neutral, objective, or universal identity masks the power of whiteness. I mean, you're speaking about de Tocqueville. Think about the tyranny of the majority there that gets slipped in. So for me, it's not a matter of, as you said, those invisibilized identities now clamor for and stand in need of recognition. What Charles Taylor talks about, the kind of politics of recognition. That is true. But at the same time, to have that then indicted as the means by which America has, or the West has, somehow disappeared before our very eyes, or the reawakenings that are occurring, I think means that we're missing a central point. And that central point is, who gets a chance to validate or invalidate identities? Who gets a chance to say this is destructive or creative? And I think that in our own culture, if we had an open competition of identities, which sounds rather miserable, according to a kind of fair basis, it would be one thing, but it's not fair at all. And the identities that are being called out, the only reason that gay or lesbian or queer or trans identities, and have what you will, are being called to account as somehow destroying the essential unity of the nation or of the culture is because the implicit power of the whiteness to determine, the rightness to determine who is in and who is out, has been challenged for the first time. Martin Luther King Jr., to me, was a great universalist. He said all men and women deserve, right? Trying to, echo Jefferson there. All men and women created equally, right? So he wants to say that, America, you have it wrong. You believe that you are the universal. You've been extremely particularist. You've slanted the debate toward a particular ideological formation that never has to come out the closet. And now that we are here, it evokes a kind of resistance. Because I think, given your I think, rather powerful and persuasive argument about and yours too, about a neo-religion and a religious formation, that happens because the real religious impulse has been displaced onto these social movements because of a failure of the religious institutions to do what they're supposed to do. They got theologies of luxury, ethics of leisure, about accommodation to capital, as opposed to the need of human beings to feel connected to each other. And social media, I would suspect that Khaled and I would agree with you about some of the damaging cancel culture, if we can call it that we would both stand tooth and nail against, because it has destroyed the fabric of community that allows people to make mistakes and to say, I'm sorry, and to grapple with how our own fallibility has to be acknowledged in the context of our relations to one another.
I think social media is a fascinating point to touch on because it's become this battleground for a lot of these conversations. Khaled, do you think that social media overall, on balance, has been positive or negative in terms of understanding some of these? Let's figure it out right now,
Yeah.
He's the young guy.
Oh, I'm not that young. Is it in balance? I think in balance, I would say it's a good thing, even though it's sort of, strapped with a range of perils and concerns that I have, and I'm sure that the gentleman with me would echo. But I think by and large, I think what's been the greatest sort of net positive with social media is its democratizing effect, that it's sort of given voice to communities, largely subaltern voices, marginalized communities, silenced communities for a long time, to finally have space and platform to air their grievances. I think what's been happening in Gaza over the last 2 years definitely represents that, right? That you could see for the first time the real struggle of Palestinians taking place in real time, right? Oftentimes, right after a building's been bombed, you see what took place. You're hearing from Palestinian men and women specifically in ways that was never the case. People, what's been more, I speak often on Gaza, what's been really sort of transformative for me is before social media and the way in which it's been broadcast during the genocide is nobody could name a Palestinian that they admired or loved before this genocide, but now young people can name Mu'taz and Bassam and Wael Dahdour, all these people. So I think that democratizing effect of social media, giving voice to silenced voices, has been a net positive. But the perils that Michael just mentioned, that cancellation, deplatforming, disabling the kind of conversations you should have with people that you disagree with, brings forward sort of like claims and movements to stigmatize individuals or to sort of ostracize them, which has a quasi-religious dimension to it as well, right? This sort of policing. But I think by and large, it's transformed discourse, but also the ways in which we can air news in ways that were impossible before its emergence.
And it's also allowed people to gather and form communities.
Yeah,
And,
which has had that's kind of like that coalescing is definitely has a religious or new religious dimension to it.
And some rather destructive and dangerous ones
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you think about, you know, people coagulating around ideals, being radicalized.
Yeah.
You know, we ascribe this to the Muslim terrorists, and as Talal Assad would talk about the suicide bomber. But
Yeah.
look at the way in which Christianity
Mhm.
has mercilessly exerted terror on people's lives, one Christian killing another.
Yeah.
I think about when Josh was mentioning about the way in which, say, certain forms of discrimination and racism existed. I mean, you had the prospect of Martin Luther King Jr. saying, I look at your churches sometime and wonder who is your God.
Yeah.
Right? I don't even know that God. I'm an atheist. Now, he didn't say this is Dysonian interpolation of Dr. King. Forgive me. But, you know, I'm an atheist. I don't even know that God. I don't even know that religious orientation. So I would have more in common with a person who claimed not to know God, not to be religiously involved, but who was concerned about care for the other, concerned about the demonization and stigmatization of marginalized or minoritized communities, or people whose voices need to be heard. I mean, I live in Tennessee, so I have a kind of affection for, you know, white hillbillies and white Southerners who are marginalized. I love because there's a convergence between hip hop culture and the blues and, you know, country music. You know, the country music lyric, if I had killed you when I met you, I would have been in jail by now. I mean, it's very interesting. You know, all my exes live in Texas. That's why I hang my hat in Tennessee. You know, in the blues, you know, hey, lady, your husband is cheating on us. So the irony, the comedy that is involved there, but the possibility of joining together and seeing the humanity in the other, those are the kind of impulses that need to be ramified and need to be echoed throughout the culture.
Joshua, what do you
Can
think?
I'm glad we're talking. I want to make a plug for the liberal middle here, not
Okay.
conservative, not left. So I think one of the problems that has happened in America in the last 10 or 15 years, and I'm going to stick with my term identity politics, and maybe we can use social justice, but I'm going to stick with that. So the liberal position is there's the rule, and then there's the exception to the rule. So most of American life, in order for America to prevail, we're going to have generative families. But then civility requires and liberalism requires that, well, then there's the exceptions to the rule. It's gay marriage, lesbian, exceptions to the rule. I think what's happened is that on the left, we've lost sight of that. And so now the exception becomes the rule. And my worry is on the left, if you're not fully for the transgender, and I'd like to hear your gentleman's view on this, because I think it's been the greatest catastrophe for the left and for gays and lesbians of the last several decades. I think it will set back the left so far, because I want to hear about the transgender thing. I think if your position is the liberal position, which is, hey, most of us aren't, but a few are, fine. But that's not been the position of the left unless you fully endorse the transgender, the gay and lesbian. You're guilty of a thought crime. Your church is homophobic. Your families are heteronormative. I think this has been a catastrophe because it does not allow genuine pluralism to perdure. It insists on a loyalty oath that most people aren't going to take. But I think a lot of people in America are fully prepared to say, hey, look, you do what you need to do, but don't make me guilty of a thought crime. And I think that's been a terrible thing. So I'd like to hear from both of you guys whether you think the full implications of social justice is the transgender movement, and I'm going to press this.
The liberal position that you sort of like honor and acknowledge everybody's individual right to lead their life the way they want to live it, I think is something that should be the foundation of a liberal society. I think where I agree with you is that there's been a sort of tendency by segments on the left to impose specific viewpoints, and that if you disagree with that viewpoint, you're going to be castigated or labeled a transphobe or a bigot.
Right.
And that's been the case. And what's interesting about that sort of observation and that development is that there's sort of a neo-religious sort of discourse around that I find highly concerning. I wouldn't say that. I don't think it has a permanence, though, to be frank with you, that it's going to be the sort of definitive issue for the far left.
The trans issue.
Yeah.
No, I think it's over now, actually.
yeah,
And I think the
yeah,
Palestinian
definitely.
cause has been the thing that
It's
separated.
supplanted it in some ways, but I think all these issues, especially in this day and age, because of social media, to sort of circle back to that issue, sort of has a transience. That we move and cycle through these issues in ways that wasn't the case 10 to 20 years ago. So where I might disagree is I think that the right sort of embellishes the trans issue as sort of a way to silence segments or to incriminate segments on the left by blowing it up as an issue that I think doesn't have the kind of sustained permanence that
But see,
people think.
here's the question too for Joshua. So, what is gained by saying that live and let live, right? Is that really what's going on? I don't see that live and let live going on in the culture. What you've just articulated is as a normative practice would be acceptable and even defensible if not for the simultaneous stigma that is heaped on this group of folk. Now, I ain't claiming to know biologically what happens and the transformations that occur, but my skepticism is generated by the fact that I tend to side with those, like the people with whom I grew up, who have been stigmatized by folk. Oh, black people marrying white people, that's out of bounds, that's, unacceptable. We had to have a Supreme Court step in. I mentioned earlier the fact that, you had white Christians who would, before they would pronounce benediction, go out and lynch a black person, come back and have church. So now I know that seems to be arcane or at least an ancient kind of malady, but I think when it comes to trans folk, we at least have to say we don't know. We're trying to figure it out. We want to listen to those whose experience it is. And I joke with some of the congregations I go to because, look, you're not speaking a foreign language, I'm sure, to either of us in terms of the religious communities that are culturally conservative, even if they're politically progressive.
Yeah, right.
They get the 10 Commandments of religion, they're down with all that. So I say, look, you're halfway there. I said, as a black person, you could, who did this? They did it. Okay, they. Who did it? Mama and them. So you got they and them. You're halfway there. You got the pronouns down. Just get some of the arguments philosophically. Now, we can have a humorous approach there, but we should be humble. And we should say, we don't know. We want to hear. We want to talk to people so we won't repeat the errors of the past. But we don't want to impose a kind of groupthink on people to punish them for having legitimate differences of opinion or asking legitimate questions like, I don't know. What does it mean?
We're all at universities. 5-10 years ago, someone decided in administration that they're going to put pronouns on.
Yep.
Now, for the whole of human history, men are men and women are women. And all of a sudden, somebody decides they're going to put pronouns, and the terror that went through the faculty, the administration, and the students, you could feel it. I teach a course on conservatives and radicals, and I ask my students, we're going to have an open classroom. We need to say what's on your mind. They will not touch that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And they won't touch the Palestinian-Israeli issue.
Yeah.
It is so lightning because there's a purity test here. So that's the first problem. The second is
distinct kinds of policing with those two examples,
yes.
though.
And the second, to come back to your point, there's a whole group of white kids who know that they are guilty of whiteness, to use Michael's language, and so they're looking for cover. I'm gay. I'm a 2 out of 5 on the masculine scale. I'm a victim of climate change. I mean, this is very real stuff. And I think you've got a whole generation looking for cover. The way I characterize it is we're all Jews practicing the Passover ritual. And by that I mean, God's wrath is going to come and kill you unless you've got the sign of innocence on your lintel or your door. And so the whole world, instead of solving problems, which is what the liberal in me wants to do, the whole world is looking for ways to indicate that they're pure. Black Lives Matter signs in the front lawn, performative justice that does nothing. I stand with Ukraine. And this is the problem with social media. It's performative justice. That's the problem. And then
I'm not sure if it's entirely performative, though. And we could talk about that if you'd like more.
Some people are doing stuff, but most people in America anyway put those little signs on their Instagram or whatever. I don't even have social media. And then they're covered. they're covered. That's not solving problems. That's why the liberal in me is saying to the identity politics folk, to think in terms of purity and stain will in no way get us to solving problems. And then, Mike, I have to ask you a question, because I've talked to...
But before that, I want to ask you about the pronouns issue, because as a professor with students that you have to teach, one thing aside with regards to what is expected online or what is expected as a faculty member, but how do you deal with this issue on a personal level with your students?
I always try to find the truth in the position that I think is wrong. And so, Mike, I want to hear your views on this. So, Christianly speaking, at the resurrection, there's no gendered body. So I see this as again, a kind of quasi-religious longing to move beyond the gendered regenerative world of time and death and birth that is our lot in history. And the Christian claim is, yeah, there is something at the end, and we're not gendered, and there's no marriage. So transgender, in some sense, that's the regenerative body, the resurrected body. So I'm going to, and I can do this in terms of Plato's Republic too, I will always look for the high road. But my point in finding the high road is to say, we're taking the low road here. We're looking for cheap shortcuts. It is a mystery why we are in our form and women are in their form. And anyone who doesn't feel estranged in their body at some point is not living. So I think we have to acknowledge that this is a universal disposition, a universal worry. But I think it's increasingly used, or it has been in the last 10 years, as a way of signaling your innocence. And medical interventions are incredibly dangerous. And I think it's been the medical evidence which has now pushed the transgender issue to the side.
But there's another historical contingency. At the very moment that we're having these questions about trans and identity, we have a crypto-fascist governmental formation that is policing out of bounds any dissent or challenge to authority, authoritarian literally, so that it makes it difficult to not at least be empathetic to people who are trans and who are making arguments about that in the midst of a cultural decline. So to me, not a metaphysical conceit over here about identity and how we understand ourselves and the self that the identity is a receptacle for. The point is that we're living in a culture that is doing all the bad stuff we say that social media is doing, except it ain't on social media. It's real. And I would never draw an equivalence between whatever, faults and flaws that our students or our human communities commit in the pursuit of a stable and rational identity or community, and folk who are actually suffering material consequences in politically devastating ways where they can't talk. So we're talking about, identity. We've got a government that is outlawing the study of enslavement in this culture and redescribing it in ways that are not only offensive, but dangerous, thinking that enslavement was a choice made. Oh, people gain certain skills, as they say in Florida, from enslavement. I mean, this kind of irrational attempt to unmake the selves that we are as America, the collective self, this whatever we are, to me is far more dangerous than the undeniable discomfort that is caused. Because I don't have all the answers. I don't pretend to, but how I treat people, what is your pronoun? How do you call yourself? Let me at least respect you. And then we can have an open and honest conversation. Can I talk to you about this? I think this is problematic. I don't think that men of a certain particular, if we're going to make it a chemistry issue, a chemical one, or we're going to make it how much testosterone, that has been challenged, right? So let's talk at least about it to understand what we don't understand. The great philosopher Stevie Wonder said, when you believe in things that you don't understand, then you suffer, but superstition ain't the way. And this to me is superstitious.
Can I respond really quickly to... Go ahead.
Why are you guys speak on the Palestinian?
Well, no. I think there needs to be a sort of like clarification of terms when you talk about the left sort of like raising up the most maximalist, victimized group. Are we talking about like grassroots left movements? Or are we talking about
elites?
Well, that isn't true then for the elites, right? Because
but Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Come on.
Okay. So when you talk about establishment gatekeepers who are sort of like aligned with the left, That's a really good example about how your observation sort of like brings to bear that the only issues, the only sort of like grievances that the establishment left will raise are those that are selectively aligned with establishment interests, right? I mean, if you bring up the Derek Bell, for instance, right, raise this idea of interest convergence theory that the left will weaponize and utilize subaltern minority grievance when it benefits the interests of the majoritarian population, largely the white and Christian population. And I think what happened during the Democratic National Convention is very, very emblematic of that in two ways. It raised up the trans issue, which was a failure. And I think the reason it was a failure, politically speaking, is the reason why it's been retrenched and declining in recent time. However, if the maximalist victimized community were Palestinians, why were they not included in the Democratic National Convention and entirely
I'm saying now,
entirely excluded?
No, I agree.
So
but
it's really,
now
I
changed.
think it's a really important, it hasn't changed. No, it hasn't changed at all because
on the left.
the Democratic Party, the establishment, when we're talking about these,
I'm talking about college kids. Where the,
Right.
the action on
Look-
the intellectual left is in the college students, and the Palestinian issue is now way more front and center than the trans issue.
But it's been but it's been suppressed,
Kyle-
right? Because they're getting arrested.
yeah, have you read the executive
There's
orders?
no,
I mean-
there's no freedom to articulate an idea to be Palestinian or pro-Palestinian or empathetic to Palestine is automatically to be seen as anti-Semitic
Yes.
or a person who is incapable
Yeah.
of acknowledging the difference between Hamas and Palestine. So I think there is a collision. But can I also jump in here and say this?
Well, college students aren't the establishment. I mean, I wouldn't
Right.
qualify them as the establishment by any stretch.
But to Joshua's point about, I think it's a very interesting one. Like we all have a sense of alienation in our body, and I think you're absolutely right, right? But is it akin to a lot of us have anxiety, but some people really have it, right?
Mhm.
Some people have diagnosable bipolar, schizophrenia, other chemically induced or culturally reinforced perceptions that lead to dangerous medical consequences. So in the same way, yes, all of us have a sense of alienation, but others have it for whatever reason. Are we curious enough to find out? Are we empathetic enough to want to know? Can we ask the person what's going on? Can we figure out a way to both acknowledge the humanity of the person who is the subject of our inquiry, while at the same time drawing lines in the sand, so to speak, and say, you know what, we don't want to impose certain things upon this vulnerable community, but at the same time, we don't want to also demonize and stigmatize those who have legitimate questions about what the heck is going on.
I'm with you, Mike.
And I
don't
do
disagree.
that not only in terms of that, in terms of race too, for me. Because when I teach at a well-known HBCU Vanderbilt, and there, that's because I'm a homeboy cutting up. But the thing is that I say very specifically, there ain't nobody gonna get called a racist for raising certain. Nobody's gonna call. Now I can't help what your classmates are gonna call you, right? You got to defend yourself there, but we are not going to delimit the nature of the conversation here. And people have to be honest and open about what they feel. And we have to protect the possibility of that open conversation in order to engage in serious learning and to exchange ideas in a liberal democracy where that is the ideal, the norm, and not the exception.
I want to stay on the issue of race because you brought up the current political climate in the United States. And one of the major talking points, the major political policies of this administration has been specifically to look at what is happening in university campuses with specifically this phrase, critical race theory. And the idea that it has become something that needs to be challenged by the political system. Khaled, I want you to just explain to us what critical race theory is and then give us what you think about this challenge that has been brought forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, all critical race theory is the idea that race is a political construction, and the law has sort of like used race in ways that advance the interests of those who are in power, and used race in ways to subjugate other groups, right? Which ties back to the initial conversation that we had about identity politics. Is you can't have a myopic sort of analysis of what identity politics is, and it must be extended to sort of come to the realization that this country was founded in identity politics, right?
So critical.
And
What is the critical and the critical race mean?
Critical race theory is to have a historical analysis to sort of identify that in 1790, right, shortly after this country became a sovereign nation, whiteness was enshrined as a prerequisite for citizenship. I mean, you laugh, but that was legislation that was enacted in 1790.
Yes, but that's because these are Northern European Protestants who wanted to keep the Catholics out, and the E Pluribus Unum contained 7 nations, and the rest of Europe, which was white, was kept out. It was Protestant.
That's selective analysis of history, right? It's selective. Additional reasons why they enshrined that legislation is they didn't want natives to be citizens, right?
Because they weren't Protestants. I mean, we might not like it, but that's the reason.
And I agree with you. Sorry, a central story of the formation of American whiteness is tethered to Protestantism, right? But we had manifest destiny. We had chattel slavery, right? We had the sort of like annexation and takeover of land that was owned by Mexicans. You can't dissect and have a historical analysis that selectively sees history in a specific way, divorced from these real passages that made America what it is.
Well, I think Joshua's point about earlier incomplete religions, this might be, Joshua, you're right, but it's an incomplete analysis in the sense that when we look at 1619, 1790, when we look at, for instance, 1812 or 1776, I mean, there are big dates out there that have consequence, and on their own, sitting in their own, bottom, we can have an analysis that is perfectly cogent, but it's not complete. Because the way in which race interacts with these other elements is extremely important. And, Black people could vote, then they couldn't vote. Women had a vote for a while, but not really. So it was not only about the Protestants and the Catholics and the way in which that kind of Bloods versus Crip drama was being played out in an earlier epic. It is also about the fact that the suppressed premise of the logic of white supremacy were these Black bodies that we didn't know what to do with, right?
Well, Joshua, what is your position on this?
So my position is the whole idea of whiteness is actually a really dangerous one. Let's start the idea of it. My view is, and here I think the three of us will agree, there are real problems and we have to address them. Okay. My argument is, my belief is that when we set up these abstract categories of impurity like whiteness, it becomes literally impossible to solve it. Let me keep going. Part of my family, not the Lebanese part, the other part, is part German. There was a cultural genocide against the Germans in the 19th century. There were hundreds and hundreds of German-speaking schools in the Midwest, Milwaukee. There was a cultural genocide against that. Where's the whiteness there? In the 1850s, going across the United States, the conductor would say, you Catholics, you get off here at this town, and you Protestants, you get off at this town. You talk to Catholics in America today, they're not even thinking about race. They're thinking about 1517, when the Reformation broke out. You have to understand, all these groups, they're not thinking that they have their own dilemmas. They don't think of themselves as white. On the right now, there's a huge Catholic contingent. Are they white? Yeah. But if you just look at it in terms of whiteness, you will completely miss what's happening in terms of the political debate on the right. This is a Catholic resurgence against Patrick Deneen and others, against the Protestant formation of the American Constitution. If you just talk about whiteness, you completely miss the
But who
game.
could be Catholic and who could be Protestant?
I just want you to unpack that. So you say that
I
on
don't
the
think
right,
it's I think it's a bad category.
So right now, when it comes to what is happening on the right in America, you see this not as an issue of white resurgence.
They will not replace us. Replacement
but
theory.
something
White
in terms of
supremacy.
a religious divide.
I'm just saying that if we're
out.
trying to solve problems, we have to have adequate categories. And I'm saying if you just look at it whiteness, there's no way you can understand the incredible complexity of the arguments on the right today. And then on the big, here, my confession, I've been lecturing on this book, American Awakening Identity Politics, for the last 5 years to conservative circles. When I talk about race, and I'm the only guy who'll do it, you can hear a pin drop. Because the view on the right, which is, in my view, a catastrophe, is, oh, no, we're all just one country. And then you can step in properly and say, well, you mean a white country, right? And my view is, no, race is the great wound in America. We agree. But if you're going to start using this language of whiteness, et cetera, what you do is, now let's talk about the consequences. What you do is 1619 Project. What have you really taught? You've not taught facts to a young generation that is isolated, alone, and feels impotent. What you've said is there's a systemic problem here that either no one can solve or only the state can solve. And so what you're yeah,
look,
that's the 16. That's the moral implication of the
no,
1619
1619 project is about doing the very thing you're speaking about, though, reminding America that the
that it's
origins.
impure.
Well, no, well, I mean,
That it's impure.
we take the well. It's not only a wound; it's an original sin. So if we shift the metaphor, we begin to understand what biblical narrative we can appeal to in order to justify, legitimate, validate, or invalidate a particular approach, a theology, a kind of anthropology there. But my point is that when we talk about whiteness, it seems to me, Joshua, that the innocence is of those who don't want to face the fact of what might have occurred. Why else do we erase the history? Why else do we forbid people from studying this? Because we don't want, let's be mundane about it, we don't want our kids to know how messed up we were in an earlier epic,
I agree
right?
with you,
That's
Mike.
one.
That study has to be done. I agree with you. I'm
Right.
not saying we shouldn't do it.
But I'm saying in terms of when you say, well, people now think it in terms of categories, right? And it's a bad category, or what the philosophers have called category mistake. So now you got, Italians and Poles and Irish, and people say, we weren't white when we came here. Absolutely right. But you've read the books, how the Irish became white by Nolik Native, or how Jews became white, right? We know that the trans reality is not simply a sexual one, but in terms of the transformation of racial identities in the crucible of American race. Ethnicity becomes pulverized and reproduced as a kind of whiteness. But let me say this about whiteness. Whiteness is not just some catch-all term. There are specificities and particularities to whiteness in terms of being poor white. Bill Clinton is different than George Bush, is different from, some other than Donald Trump. So that there are categories of whiteness, the possessive character of whiteness, speaking about race and the law, Cheryl Harris's notion of whiteness as a property. There are an infinite variety, not infinite, but an enormous variety of differences of whitenesses that need to be articulated. So this is not demonizing white people. Aha, you're a horrible human being. It's trying to interrogate the practice of race as it has gone on in America that has denied legitimacy to so many others who are not white, and white people don't even have to contend with what it means to be white in America. It's like men, when we talk about gender, well, you have one too. When we talk about race, it's not just Latinos or African Americans, it's about white folk too. How do we get that on the conversation, on the bill, to be spoken about without carrying the kind of callous problems that you see in the offing when whiteness is brought up? How can we talk about white responsibility without talking about white demonization?
So can I jump in on this?
Sure.
So look, as I said, I am capital L liberal in that there are problems to be solved. And my view is when people are told that they are simply guilty and irredeemably so, you get people who are going to go off. It's the Nick Fuentes of the world. It's a whole generation of young men that I have taught, and I keep track of them. They are so incredibly angry because they've been told they have a stain they cannot erase. That is a problem. And I have to ask, okay, fine. I am with you. This is why the alt-right worries me so much.
Yeah.
I want us all to take a good, hard moral reckoning of the blood and suffering of history. And it's 1,000 times worse than any of us know. Why do I think that? Because I'm a Christian who believes in original sin.
Right.
So you and I are going to go along with that. Okay. So, but the question is, what do we do with it? What's the political payoff of telling groups that they have this irredeemable stain that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years? The political payoff, as I said a minute ago, and please tell me if I'm wrong, is either it can't be fixed or only the state can fix it. And if you look at the history of Black thought, you correct me, okay? But here's where I'm going. Multiple trajectories, but certainly up to 1960, all of them believed in agency. Agency. Malcolm X.
Sure.
All of them believed in agency.
And still do.
I don't.
Agency,
Michael, I don't believe that's
you heard
true.
of this guy.
When you say agency, you mean community responsibility?
No, I mean that they believed that they could be free actors even in the face of oppression, and
Of
that's
course.
good.
Even in enslavement.
Yes.
This is the argument. But
Yes.
here's my point. Martin Luther King Jr., of all human beings, recognized, I think, iconically, arguably the greatest American who ever lived, certainly in the top 10. As Drake would say, top 2 and I ain't number 2. But the point is that Martin Luther King Jr. Talked about redeeming the nation through black bloodshed.
Yeah.
White people murdered him.
Well,
right?
so did James
Whiteness
Cone.
murdered, right?
The whole idea of
course.
black religion,
But, absolutely. But my point is this, is that if we're talking about transforming America through the shedding of black blood, where is the corollary white Martin Luther King Jr. who said we should sacrifice our blood
Abraham
for
Lincoln
the
said
beginning?
it in the second inaugural. It's
Wait a
right
minute.
there on the Lincoln Memorial.
Abraham
he said
Lincoln.
blood for blood.
That wasn't no movement. That was an assassination.
I'm
right?
saying that
Right.
he understood this. It's in Christian
course.
terms. There must be the shedding of blood.
But I'm saying Martin Luther King Jr. led a movement
Yeah.
where people followed him, where the consequences were material. They weren't merely psychological, though Malcolm X's understanding of the black psychology in a white supremacist nation that had taught us to hate ourselves, right? The purity, the impurity that we bore automatically on sight, which, by the way, is not only CRT, but DEI. So now any black person in a particular position is automatically inferior, incapable, is incompetent. And I know you brilliantly deal with the notion of incompetence, but here we have the most fascist, ill-informed, lugubrious lechery that has been unleashed on the American scene in the name of American competence while demonizing and stigmatizing entire populations. Where is the white liberal response to say, no, that is not true? We know black people. We know people of color. We know people of minoritized traditions. You cannot automatically stigmatize them. In fact, DEI was a compromise because we didn't want reparation. We didn't want affirmative action. So we compromised by saying diversity was the means by which we could articulate these noble ideals, and even that is under assault, as if somehow black people who in their inferiority seek to have a leg up, when we know, and I don't want to demonize white brothers and sisters, but we know a lot of incompetent white people, because we see them in the present administration, who have no skill. And I don't see white liberals attacking that issue, speaking about that issue to the degree that they are somehow offended by the fact that, well, black people are getting stuff they don't deserve, white women are getting stuff they don't deserve, other able people are getting stuff they don't deserve. If we could have a balance, then I think your notion here, Joshua, could really go a long way in terms of bringing us together. But we can't have e pluribus unum if at the very notion of e pluribus unum is attended by the fact that some people were excluded from the contract, weren't even considered to be part of it. The Protestants versus Catholics, you couldn't even get in on that battle, even if we wanted to. That's why Jefferson called these black people disloyal, because they were listening to the British going, hey, we'll hook you up if you come join us. Who wouldn't do that? It's like the argument about Marxism. Are you as a black person a Marxist? I'm for whatever's going to help me out and get me out of the hell you have me in. And let me end by saying this. I remember Derek, I was on a panel with Derek Bell, and this is in your favor, Joshua. So I'm on a panel with Derek Bell, and Derek Bell saying, the communists are coming to Harlem and they're recruiting black people, come on and join us, and this is what it's going to be. He said, a black man raised his hand. He said, can I ask you a question? After revolution come, are you still going to be white? Right, because that guy understood that there's something that supersedes even the ostensible collection of identities under the rubric of class. And I know you talk about Lewis Hart in the 50s or Werner Sombart in 1907, why there's no socialism in America, the lack of a feudal past. But the point is that what they understood, even under the class rubric, there was racial hostility and differentiation. When we talk about the class war, what class are we talking about? What working class went for Donald Trump? Not black working class, not Latino working class, although more than among African Americans. So I'm saying all of this to say, at the end of the day, what we want is equal participation in a peaceful colloquy of ideas that allows us to make decisions premised upon agency and desire, and not compulsion and coercion, and not being automatically considered to be inferior from the jump. I think that's a very important point that we don't address.
I want to pull back a bit from the United States and take a look,
Okay.
because I mean I think there's a lot going on here, but part of it is this discussion about identity and justice and how these things come into play with each other. How do you talk about them politically? And we've seen over the last couple of years, over the last decade and a half, tremendous social upheaval in many parts of the world. The Arab Spring, which you've written about before. Of course, the Palestinian movement, which is not just rooted in college campuses in the United States, but it is a global movement. You're seeing lots of social upheaval in Southeast Asia and Africa. Khaled, when you look at what has been happening, how do you explain why there's so much discontent and so much of a search for justice happening in the world as we live it today?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single thread like across these distinct geographies, right? I think that, you can bring it back to social media. I think social media has been a conduit for, aggrieved communities across these spaces to raise issues and to mobilize. And I mean, the Arab Spring was definitely, an example of the ways in which it can be, galvanizing, give rise to revolutions that were once preempted by authoritarian governments. But I think that there's also, tying it to, if you want to sort of to globalize the conversation on whiteness, and it's not a perfect analog, right? But I think that there is some sort of parallel with the way in which colonized populations, right? And specifically populations that have been colonized by Western European countries, have been imposed upon governments that are essentially proxies for those governments that have not served them, right? We can talk about, across the Arab world, across Southeast Asia, across Latin America, where, populations are finally rising up. And I think Gaza has an interesting role. Gaza might be a sort of like common denominator to sort of highlight the idea that, this myth of like Western rule of law and human rights that has been sort of like flouted by, powerful Western governments is in fact mythic, right? And in some respects, like whiteness, being used as a sort of like agile and malleable tool to advance the interests of a select few. The rule of law has had that similar sort of dynamic, right? Where Western governments have said, look, we want you to democratize. We want you to implant these forms of government, codes, criminal codes, civil codes, and so on that look like ours. But they haven't worked for these populations, right? And I think that you're seeing these uprisings largely on account of, failed governments that have served the interest of a select few that have been supported and propped up by Western governments. That would be a common theme, I think.
I mean, one of the things that you've written about is the racialization of the Muslim identity, for example,
Yeah.
and how that fits into the global war on terror. How do you think this fits in with this conversation about identity versus religion? What happens when those two things? I mean, was that a consequence of identity politics?
Well,
that
look, and
Muslims
there's so much I wanted to sort of chime in on, with the colloquy with the two gentlemen here, right? I think, first of all, look, it's critical to know, and back to critical race theory, is the idea that race and religion aren't necessarily mutually exclusive categories, right? Religion has been racialized, in many, serious and interesting ways, especially in the American experience, but also globally, right? So religion has been sort of like crafted and curated in specific ways that align with whiteness to advance white interests in a range of ways. I think what's interesting around the conversations tied to Islam specifically is that because Islam, and we can talk about Edward Said and Orientalism, has been oriented as a non-white religion. It's been constructed in ways that have been demonized for centuries, and specifically, I think, even more ominously in the post-9/11 context, where it's easy to castigate Islam as being warmongering, violent, prone to violence, patriarchy, lack of modernity, backwardness, sexism, misogyny. So it's been, in many respects, classed as non-religion from the vantage point of the Christian West, right? Which has greater traction now, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror. And obviously we're seeing what's happening in Gaza, where in ways that Michael talked about, white Christianity sort of like, coming along with the sort of privileges of individuality, invisibility, the presumption of innocence. The converse is true for Islam, right? It's viewed as a monolith. Right? Muslims who are especially pious and practicing are classed as being collectively guilty as a consequence of their identity. We see this in Gaza specifically. Remember that picture where the IDF rounded up 40 Palestinian men, stripped them of their clothes, blindfolded them, lined them up like animals on the soil, right, in Gaza? The message there was that these brown Muslim men are automatically guilty of terrorism as a consequence of who they were, not what they did, which clashes entirely with principles of due process and the rule of law that the West touts, right? So these sort of like emanations, these positive emanations and presumptions that are assigned to Christianity are negated entirely when it comes to Islam, right? Presumption of guilt as a consequence of who you are, collective guilt, a monolithic class. So this story of Islam and Islamophobia, I think, is an interesting sort of like, contribution to the conversation we can have on religion broadly.
Joshua, do you think that the West still sees itself through a Christian lens, especially when it looks at its role in the world?
Well, here I'll partly agree with Khalid's account of what's been happening. My view is that, first of all, if you want to just use the term white, there is a titanic battle between neoliberal whites and the hillbillies that we know, okay? The MAGA people. So that white is not one on this one. This is a huge battle. Give me your question.
Well, because that's interesting too, because that also feeds into issues of class and structures of
whether the West is religious
and religion.
So I think here I'm going to say something controversial. Probably stop now.
This is why we're here.
Okay. So in the 18th and 19th century, Christian missionaries went out to the world and tried to Christianize the world. And my view is that identity politics is the latest version of Christian missionary work. When I taught at Georgetown starting in 2005, identity politics did not exist, and my Muslim students came in and they felt just fine being Muslim students. And the last time I was there, which was 2019, I had a covered Qatari woman come into me and say, Professor Mitchell, why are your colleagues, mostly on the left, telling me I have an identity? I'm a Muslim. Now, this is very, very telling, because my view is this, to come back to what I said at the outset, identity politics is linked in the Christian category of the innocent victim, full stop. The category of the innocent victim is not a theologically central category in either Islam or Judaism. And so my view is, in the 17th and 18th century, the Christian missionaries went out and tried to Christianize the world. And in the 21st century, the elites that have promulgated this at the elite Ivy universities and at Georgetown are going out, Education City and the rest, and they're promulgating this idea of identity politics, which is the incomplete religion version of Christianity. And this is the new imperialism. So my view is all of these issues have to be dealt with. But when people on the left use the language of identity politics, I'm thinking this is the incomplete version of Christianity. Why would any Muslim in their right mind adopt this Christian derivative as a way of thinking through their problems? This is the confirmation of the West's continued influence on the Muslim world and the rest of the world. And my view is, if you want to talk about the Palestinian issue, don't adopt, in purely Islamic, Muslim, Middle Eastern terms, do not use this language of identity politics. But that's what's happened. This is the Christianization of the rest of the world, seeing the very real problems of the world in terms of the category of innocent victimhood. Including, by the way, the colonized and the colonized. This is the colonizer and the colonized. This is the same language. Here are the pure ones, here are the dirty ones. It's the same language.
But it didn't begin now. Your genealogy is powerful, but to me incomplete. The origin of that us versus them, that Manichaean distinction, resides in a Christianization of the world. And I don't know how far you want to go. The auto da fe, the Crusades, what Christianity did when they got in power, the Constantinian compromise and so on. My point is that identity only becomes an issue when the dominant identity, which never has to assert itself, becomes challenged. There are no identity politics when Columbus is slaughtering West Indians or, trying to establish the world, and, blankets that are full of disease are given to native peoples and indigenous folks. There's never a question of identity when the dominant identity has to come out the closet. And I think this is what we mean by the incomplete term whiteness. We know it covers a multitude of sins, and it covers it's a rubric that tries to be full of nuance at a certain level and complication by saying that identity politics doesn't begin when whiteness is finally put in its place, or at least challenged to understand what its place is, that before then, there was no challenge. You know, let me give you an example. So Babe Ruth hit, 714 home runs. He didn't hit 714 home runs against the best ball players. He hit them against the best white ball players. Right? So there was a Negro League, and Satchel Paige and Frank Robinson coming up later, and, you know, all the great players there. Willie Mays, arguably the greatest player we've ever seen. So that the game was rigged from the beginning. The identity of whiteness was seen as universal. So when you want to become American, become white. Become more Christian, become white. Become more capitalist, become white. Whiteness is a signifier that is free-floating, that has both material consequence and metaphysical intensity, and those who challenge it are seen as the carriers of the very disease we've inherited from the dominant culture. If we concede the legitimacy that identity politics is the problem, it ain't begun with Islam. It didn't begin with black or brown or red people. It began with a whiteness that refuses to absolve itself of its own innocence, to admit that it has been the most innocent identity articulated. And nobody is better at this, to me, I don't know how you feel about James Baldwin, than James Baldwin interrogating that whiteness and talking about it in a very powerful and, I think, unrepentant way.
So let me ask you, Michael, Baptist tradition.
Right.
Is the language of original sin not adequate to this problem? Why wouldn't the language of original sin actually be a deeper way of wrestling with this problem?
Then identity.
So the original sin claim is you're calling me a racist. You're not, but you're
right. Right. Gotcha.
Is that all you got?
Right.
In other words, I'm a racist. I'm a this. Every single morning I wake up and I'm in a revolt against God and revolt against my fellow man.
Right.
So what would be wrong? Why is that inadequate? This is why I started out by saying we've moved from a Christian account in the West to this new one, which is an incomplete version of that. And my view is, if you don't return to that complete version of it, which is, say, original sin, and then all the stuff you're talking about, all the sins, all of it should be studied, all of it should be put on the table, to which you say, yes, this is proof that me as a human being and as a member of a group is guilty. Yes. My worry is that what's happened, now we're coming back to the alt-right stuff. When you tell people, when you do that kind of research and say you're guilty of whiteness, there's a whole bunch of people, Michael, who just going to say,
cut you off.
I don't give a, excuse my language. I am done. I'm not going to be told that I'm irredeemably stained. And so I'm going to go transgender. I'm going to go gay to find some way of covering my sin.
Right. But it's not irredeemable. That's the point. I mean,
so where's the redemption?
I agree with you. Here's the redemption. Admit it. Let's talk about it. Let's have laws that change it. Let's have practices in culture that challenge it. Let's have a CRT, which, by the way, also means, critical theory, from Horkheimer to Adorno to Marcuse, what they were, negative dialectic, partly what they're about. Marcuse teaches Angela Davis, right, in California. Partly what critical theory simply is I want to find the best way to have emancipation at the heart of my project. So the point is, the reason I don't presume that original sin would work for them, because this ain't a Christian nation in that way. I want all people to participate. So let me translate it into a language that is viable for those who don't participate in my religion. So for instance, we're in America now. We're living through an enormous amnesia about a figure like a Charlie Kirk, right? Who, first of all, him being murdered was evil, wrong, full stop, ain't no qualification. Because all of us who talk for a living don't want to be murdered for our ideas. So what happened to that young man is unforgivable. It is wrong. It is evil. And it is also true that Charlie Kirk promoted despicable, vile beliefs in the name of this original sin in Christianity, except he felt that white people were exempt from the kind of condemnation that he levied against other vulnerable minority people. And the comparison of him to Martin Luther King Jr., Charlie Kirk used his power to make America a Christian nation, Martin Luther King Jr. used his Christianity to make it a just nation. So
And I
even
wanna
if you
bring
didn't
you in.
believe in what he believed, original sin, you could find a language that was powerful, that built in forgiveness, that built in redeemability, because this is his argument with Malcolm X. This is his argument with black nationalists. I believe that white folk can not be devils, right, in terms of the language, that they are human beings who are possible, who it is possible for them to be changed. So there's no irredeemability in the argument of black transformative power within a Baptist tradition, within a black religious tradition, within the sacred language of African American piety.
I
So
wanna
just one second.
You jump in,
do-
but I got to come
yeah,
back to this at some point.
Sure.
No, no,
I,
no,
I,
please.
I will come back to this.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Khaled, about this idea of the rejection of these identities, the rejection of whiteness, the getting
Yeah.
to a point where, as Joshua described, where some elements of the right say, I don't care about any of this stuff. I'm moving beyond it. I'm not going to acknowledge it. I'm not going to acknowledge this original sin. Do you think that is a consequence? Do you think that's the fault of identity politics, of these social movements, to create this kind of backlash?
Yeah, it's a heavy question. And I think that you said something that I think was, I just have to sort of take umbrage with that identity politics is the new imperialism, right? I mean, what kind of power is it backed by for it to be imperial in nature? That's the first thing I want to start off by saying. But
And that's what I meant by metaphysical conceit versus material consequence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Second, I would say that I do agree, because I am oftentimes in these like leftist, progressive, activist spaces where you can sense an exhaust from individuals who are white in being in those spaces that ultimately alienates them. So by saying that, though, we have to be really careful in acknowledging the analysis matters, right? I think that the left isn't monolithic. Right. There are segments of the far left that I take considerable concern with, where there is a stacking up of identities to sort of raise up your sort of political or existential currency within those spaces that I find problematic. Right. There's a law scholar by the name of Nancy Leong who talks about this dialectic of racial capitalism and identity entrepreneurship, that there are individuals who sort of want to flout their,
Of course.
sort of like, mounting vulnerabilities and marginalizations because it makes them more important in those spaces, right? And I find that to be highly concerning.
True.
But the power of whiteness is that unlike Muslim identity or Black identity or Latinx identity is, you don't have to present it to bear the benefits of it. It just exists. Its invisibility, as you mentioned earlier, Mike, is what makes it so formidable. So Charlie Kirk doesn't come out and have to say, I'm a white supremacist, right, explicitly, to evoke that message. Nick Fuentes doesn't have to come out and say, whiteness should stand as the pinnacle of America's social order. It exists by virtue of his, corporal presentation and the broader message that he's giving. On the flip side, because when we talk about marginalized communities, they're not invisible. Right, they don't get to benefit from that invisibility, innocence, and individuality. You have to raise that identity. You have to make it. You have to make it plain. You have to make it presentable for you to sort of like state your existence in specific spaces. When we talk about Georgetown, for instance, or the Arizona State University, Harvard, elite institutions, right? These are institutions where minority groups have been foreclosed access to for considerable segments of society. And these are religious scholars. I'm a law professor. So it's impossible for me to not bring in the importance of structural legal retrenchment to this conversation. You can't blame identity politics when the court, right, the Supreme Court, various presidential administrations have progressively retrenched and eliminated programs that have sought to redress these original sins that we talk about, right? Over the course of several decades, So what is the role of the state in essentially creating this vacuum where these, maverick actors, who are seeking to sort of bring about some sort of redress from grassroots, civil society, are seeking to do, because the state has failed in doing so. And the state has not only failed in doing so, but largely white gatekeepers have disabled the state from bringing about the kind of reforms and solutions that would resolve much of what it is we're talking about.
Or been complicit directly in them.
and benefited from them.
Joshua, I see you writing things
Yeah,
down. What
just
do you
a
what do
couple
you have to
things.
say?
I'm not here to apologize for the Trump administration, but let me explain what I think the problem
Feel
on
free.
the right is. And I think this is bigger than the Trump administration. I started out by talking about this earlier when I said I talk to conservative audiences and I say no race is a wound in America, and you hear a pin drop. I think the failure of the right has been an absolute inability to recognize that the wound of slavery we are still enduring it, and it's going to take another century or two to get over it. And to pretend that there isn't a problem confirms exactly what you guys are saying. It's the James Baldwin problem of amnesia. So I'm with you on that. But let me pick up on something. I know I'm older than you, but
I don't know. How old are you?
70.
Oh, you look good.
You look good.
You look phenomenal.
Start saying what he's saying.
So
What's your skincare routine?
after. So you raised something. It kind of jarred my mind. You were talking about what was happening in the 50s and 60s in Martin Luther King, and there's something that I call the John Rawls problem. So Rawls writes this book, The Theory of Justice, in 1971, and my view was that put an incredible damper on American political discourse, because prior to that, whether it's Martin Luther King or Bishop Fulton Sheen in the 1950s, these Catholics had television shows, the most watched shows in America.
Yeah.
And what happened
Over there,
starting in
Uncle Milton Berle.
1970s was John Rawls talks about this thing called public reason. And basically, your religious convictions, check them at the door. If you can't make an argument based on public reason, then we're not going to listen to you. And that meant that Catholics, Baptists, Presbyterians, they had to put duct tape over their mouth and do an active translation. So to the Charlie Kirk thing, I never heard anything that I thought was horrible, but
Black women are stupid, dumb.
Listen, you're going to have to literally show me the tapes. I've not seen it, and I'm not here to defend or detract. But what I
It's
am
available.
here to say,
You can look it up.
what I am
It's
here to
pretty
say
bad.
though is that when after 60 years of muzzling people's religious convictions and keeping them out of the public space, what happens when it finally starts reemerging is it comes in all sorts of
That's true.
kind of distorted ways. It's going to take us a while. Just like if you tell men and women that they're completely the same, and then you decide, well, maybe they're not, then men are going to start, when they're finally given the opportunity to act like men, they're not going to act like men. They're going to act like beasts. So I'm saying we're now entering a new phase, I think. The post-1945 order, John Rawls, all that, where you can't have strong beliefs. Martin Luther King was the last one, which is why he's the greatest one of the 20th century. I agree.
But Joshua, can I say this?
But just let me just
Okay,
we're entering a new phase where now suddenly these deep convictions are going to be allowed. They're going to be out there. And is there going to be bumping and bruising? Yes, there is. But I would prefer a Martin Luther King and a Charlie Kirk to say it out loud, and to have everybody else, Muslims, Jews, everybody else, be able to say what they believe from the vantage point of their deepest religious convictions. And then all of us in the public sphere have to make the translation. Well, that guy's a Muslim. I don't believe his theology, but I kind of like what he's saying, and so therefore I'm going to accept that. We need to return to a strong, robust pluralism that Martin Luther King had.
But Charlie Kirk doesn't and didn't.
Yeah.
But here's the point.
That coupling is really
that's
vile.
the only thing they have in common is their last name
Which
started
coupling?
Kirk and Martin Luther King.
No, I
The
didn't
on-
couple them.
The only way they both last names begin with K and they have 4 letters. I mean, but there's no similarity otherwise. But here's my point, to take you seriously. Charlie Kirk wanted to undermine the very basis of my existence as a black citizen in America. Number one. Number two, thank God that their religious beliefs didn't prevail. And I say this as a Christian. I say this as a Baptist minister. I am living in mortal fear of white Christians who believe God told them to hate me, to demonize people who follow Islam, or anybody who's not a Christian, but not a Christian in their way. The Christian identity movement is the worst form of identity politics imaginable. So when they took prayer out of school and look what happened, thank God. First of all, nobody can stop you from praying. Lord, let me have this test score that I need to get into to ASU or to Georgetown. But the point is that when you talk about translating it, the Rawlsian problem in 71, and his original position, I think, is even more compelling, because I can imagine if it's going to be done to me in the original position, I at least have more sympathy with you when I craft law
or a craft custom or tradition. My point is that when you say they've been bottled up, who? Thank God they bottled up these white Christians who were murdering black Christians. They were lynching us. Medgar Evers is a God-fearing man who was killed by a white man, Byron Della Beckwith, who believed he was doing the will of God. The white citizens' councils, the white identity movement, the Ku Klux Klan, they were burning crosses. They were not burning crescents and stars. They were burning crosses. And I'm saying to you, that is Christian terror up close. Thank God there was a mediating force. Lyndon Baines Johnson was, to me, a vehicle of the Almighty because he imposed upon this white ethnocracy an appreciation for the humanity of those who were not like those white Christians. I think white Christian nationalism, white Christian religious belief, or white Christianity at all is part of the problem that we have to address. And the refusal to acknowledge its complicity in forms of oppression is the very innocence about which you rail against in terms of identity politics that are the worst among white Christians.
And not only historically, right? We've had this conversation with regard to history. What's happening presently sort of like brings to bear what Michael is talking about. Just last week, we're all from Michigan, right? You guys know Dearborn, Michigan is.
Right.
Dearborn, Michigan is the Arab American and Muslim American capital of the United States.
Before then, it was a scary place for black people. Trust me, bro.
No, it was. I know Orville Hubbard's history. I do.
Oh, yeah.
But you had a white Christian nationalist, come into Dearborn specifically to burn a mosque, right? Raising and weaponizing Christianity as an instrument to otherize and provoke violence on a Muslim community. Not only in the United States, right? This has been the case in Sweden, right? In Denmark and across Europe with what's his name? Rasmus Paludan, right? Goes into Muslim enclaves and burns mosques under the banner of Christianity. So this weaponization of whiteness entwined with Christianity is not only a historic phenomenon, and it has present legs that I think are even more ominous than these brazen examples we've raised. When you talk about Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens is an interesting example because she isn't white, even though there's an aspirational whiteness, I think, going on with her. Charlie Kirk, Nick Fuentes, all these guys, right? They're not appealing to the KKK. They're not appealing to neo-Nazis. They're appealing to Samuel Huntington, who wrote this book in 2004 called Who Are We? Right? Grappling with this question, this existential question as to who Americans are, right? And his thesis essentially is American identity is rooted in white Protestant identity. And if you don't assimilate to that identity, you're essentially a second or third class citizen. So we can caricature this sort of like ominous white Christian, violent faction as just being these brazen, explicit vigilante groups. These are Harvard professors.
It's normalized.
Exactly.
It's normalized. And as a result of that, again, what Joshua was saying is powerful. If white Christians would take a mirror and say what we're doing is the very sin that Joshua identifies among these identitarian groups. The biggest identity in the West is an unacknowledged white identity that continues to flourish, metastasize across the body politic as a cancerous cell that continues to undermine the health of the body politic.
So I'm going to charge you guys as neoliberals. You guys are both neoliberals.
No, I don't think I'm a neoliberal at all. I would actually think I'm a liberal / libertarian in some ways.
Why you guys are neoliberal?
Okay. Tell us why.
So the neoliberal position is don't believe anything too strongly. Don't believe anything too strongly. We're now cosmopolitan. You can't. I'm surprised you didn't agree with me. You can't bring your deepest held convictions to the table. Look, if you're asking me whether I think
you can.
Christian nationalism is unequivocally evil or good, I'm never going to give that. Why? Because the same Christianity that killed Medgar Evers is the same Christianity that in 1776 had the slogan, "No king but King Jesus, and therefore we're going to have a revolution." It's the same Christianity.
It ain't the same. It ain't the same, Joshua.
No. You want to make it unmixed, and I'm saying it's always going to be mixed. And so you guys are pointing out the downside, and I'm saying you're not living in the right historical moment. The neoliberal moment is over. We are now going to enter a moment where the strong gods return, to use Rusty Reno's language. And the strong gods are Christian nationalism, whatever the version is in the Islamic world. That 1945 to 2000, whatever, 20, that is over. And that moment occurred because after 2 world wars of people believing in something, we got to the place, John Rawls is emblematic, where we said, don't believe anything too strongly. It's only public reason, no deep convictions. I'm just telling you guys whether you like it
We
or not.
believe
We
it's
are
strong.
now.
Well, I'm
wait a
Muslim,
minute.
so I have strong
Okay,
religious
fine, but you guys,
Wait a
you guys are
But
saying
I have strong
Christianity is this.
No,
and,
I
and,
think
I'm saying it's both. It's both the ugly and the good.
Oh, there's no
as is
question about
Islam.
it. No, that's not.
But I only heard about the bad stuff.
But wait a minute. No.
What do you say to this charge that Michael gave, that the problem with whiteness is its refusal to acknowledge its own identity, and that its identity fits
I
in a
can't even begin
framework?
with the term whiteness. My father's Lebanese. Okay, he goes to the State Department. All of his friends get ambassadorship jobs in the 1950s and 1960s because they're part of WASP America. My father alone doesn't because he's Lebanese. Don't talk to me about whiteness. I want to hear about it.
But there's a legal genealogy
doesn't
behind
that-
that, though,
but-
right?
But aren't you kind of agreeing with Michael in this
That
way?
what?
That whiteness is a force and identity that has existed
White-
in America.
The great Achilles heel of this thing called identity politics is the univocality of group identity. It's just not correct.
But who taught us that? Who's the big daddy of
I
it?
got to
All right,
bring
fair
into the
enough.
law because I actually wrote an academic article in a book on this very issue. In 1915, there was a case called Dow versus the United States, where Lebanese Christians specifically successfully gained whiteness as a consequence of the religious identity, as a consequence of their Christianness. Right? That's well, let me finish. That specific court denied that Muslims could become white as a consequence of the religious identity. Muslims did not become, Arab Muslims specifically, did not become white in this country until 1944, a case called Ex parte Mohriz. And the reason whiteness was awarded to that Saudi Muslim in that case is because you had Aramco. And Charles Wayzansky, the judge in that case, did not want to disrupt the economic deal that the United States struck with Saudi Arabia, because declining that a Saudi Muslim was not white had the opportunity, or might have had the effect of undermining that economic deal with Saudi Arabia. Again, pointing to Derek Bell, interest convergence, religion being selectively deployed in ways that benefit the majoritarian population. So the Lebanese story is a mixed story, because the first wave of Lebanese immigrants that came to this country were overwhelmingly Christian, and as a consequence of their Christian identity and their phenotype, were able to become white. That wasn't the story for Muslims.
Yeah, look, please don't misunderstand. When I see things like this, I ask this simple question: Can these problems of deep historical prejudice, can they be ameliorated within the framework of the American Constitution and the language of pluralism, or must we invoke identity politics? And my view is all the problems that we are talking about can all be understood and addressed within the existing legal framework.
I think you have a very narrow and I think politicized definition of what identity politics means that is only being ascribed to the left. Where Michael and I have been trying to tell you for the last hour is that we agree in part, but you can't excise, I think, the fundamental identity politic that made the United States and much of the West what it is. And
So
that
why
is
didn't that show up 200 years ago? Why didn't we start talking about identity 200 years ago?
Because whiteness wasn't challenged to the same
Yeah,
degree,
because
not outed as one among a variety of ethnicities or racial formations, because, we began to understand, in arguing for freedom and struggling against white supremacy and struggling against economic inequality and social injustice, the whiteness had to contend for the first time with, settler colonialism and racialized capitalism, all that stuff. The point is that for the first time, they had to make a valid defense of their hind parts, and they were resentful and still are. So when you tell me that white students are resentful, young white men are resentful, incels and whoever else, these people are aggrieved at the fact that they have somehow cowered in the corner as a result of the exercise of illegitimate power by Black or Muslim or women or trans people, is a mythology, because the truth is that they are responding to finally having been called on the carpet to account in ways that Black people have had to do from the very beginning. Step aside, drink out of water fountain, go to this college. If you're a Muslim, you are an automatic terrorist, right? The stigma that has been associated with every identity that is not white has not been accounted for. And as a result of that, there's a missing link. The resentment of contemporary white people misses a historical epic where we had to grapple with white whiteness for the first time, and it had to be held to account. And this is the result. We have enslavement for 200, 300, 400 years. We have Reconstruction for 12, and then we have white retrenchment, white resistance, and then white retaliation and vengeance against the very principles and carriers of the principles that they claim are illegitimate. Black people were the most powerful form of Christian articulation in this country, and I would argue still are. White nationalists are not the most valuable, valid, or vital, or even virtuous expressions of Christianity, and we can't get that acknowledged because race trumps their religious belief. The real religion in America is whiteness. It is not Christianity.
Michael, the category, to come to your point as well, categorized as white for the purpose of the census, right? And I think the census is actually something we need to take a good hard look at, because I think starting
but not the census. That wasn't the origin. That wasn't the origins.
I understand, but categorized as white, but then they would be counted as white, and we know this.
To become citizens, to become naturalized citizens.
Okay, but I'm saying one of our big problems in America today is the census. I do not think the category white or the other categories, I don't think that they're adequate at all anymore. And I think we need to return to national origin. On the matter of whiteness, I'm going to keep coming back to this.
National origin, do you mean
where you came from? I don't white. That doesn't mean a
so
damn
about
thing
you couldn't
to me.
figure out where you
German
came from. What about they denied the
American,
That's fine. That's fine. I understand.
Right.
We do what we can, but I'm saying that category is, I think, a category that does not allow us to solve problems. And I want to remind you guys, I agree with you that there are lots of problems. I'm not disagreeing that there aren't problems. What I'm disagreeing with you about is the categories you're using in order to address these problems. I don't think that can be solved
What
at all.
acceptable categories to you would foster a kind of communion of saints that would allow us to ameliorate these problems?
So I started down this road a while ago, but we didn't get the chance to move in this direction. I say, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that the political outworking of, say, a 1619 project, or of, do you mind if I use the term identity politics? Of identity politics, in which there is this thing called whiteness, which is a univocal category. The political outworking of this is so disastrous for our country right now that it must be overcome. Why? Because the 1619 project effectively said that America is impure. Now, conservatives responded in an incorrect way by saying, no, the founding is pure. I disagree with both conditions. Why? Because the human condition is always this mix of purity and impurity. My concern is that a whole generation of people of every type is now living in the strange identity politics world, and we've discussed this right here, even though we haven't given a name to it, where the psychological experience is the following. I'm discovering my identity. I'm discovering the extent to which the past has formed me in really deleterious ways. I become empowered. And at the same moment, the necessary correlative is there's nothing I can do because these forces are so systemic. And so a whole generation is now oscillating back and forth between feeling radically empowered by the language of identity and utterly impotent. And Tocqueville had a phrase at the end of Democracy in America, because he predicted exactly this thing. He said, I foresee a day coming, listen carefully, when human beings will see themselves as greater than kings and less than men. This is a description of manic depression and bipolarity. And what I'm saying to you is that this empowerment through identity has as its corollary the understanding that the whole world is so systemically against you that there's nothing you can do. That is a catastrophe of the first order. And so my view is that there is a way. There's the only way we can actually address the race issue in America. The only way. Because the state can't do it. The state has been meddling in black affairs from the very beginning. There are two groups in America that have been under the receivership of the state, the American Indians and Black Americans. How has that helped? So what? Furthermore, confirmation that there's this systemic racism, and so, oh, great, more state programs. It hasn't worked. It will never work. And so my view is a Tocquevillian view, which is the only way Black America survived, because the state was against it, was because it formed all of these informal associations that Theda Skocpol has been writing about in Harvard. Blacks are the citizens that join more than any other group. Why? Because the state was against them. And so what happens with Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is actually a demon in my view, what happens when the affirmative action programs emerge is all the informal networks that kept Black America together in the face of all the things that you're talking about. all those things get dismantled because the state steps in with program after program after program, undoes and dissolves the cohesiveness of these communities. And so out of wedlock birth rates go way up. All that stuff.
But these were conservative movements. I mean, if you track the
affirmative action.
Affirmative action was an executive order that was essentially brought to bear by John F. Kennedy that was made
Nixon
into a
tried to use
program
it to break the
by the
unions
Civil
and so
Rights Act 3 years later. But then you had the Supreme Court slash affirmative action 14 years later with Bakke versus University of California. In the 80s, you had a whole range of race-conscious remedial programs being slashed by a conservative court, right? So this is you have
it's an H.L. Mencken thing.
Exactly. You have to have a proper political slash legal analysis to understand how the state has attempted at certain instances, right, to correct this issue, the issues around racism and its residual effects.
But if the state messed it up, the state's got to fix it up. So the point is, the state has been complicit. Look, Jim Crow was a state program and project. Right. It was sponsored by Nestle's and Kellogg's, right? I mean, it's literally
upheld by the Supreme Court with Plessy.
No doubt about it, right? And reinforced. So my point is that I don't disagree with you in terms of understanding the consequences of a 1619 project. But the beauty of the 1619 project is that it brings front and center the grappling with what the origins of this nation have been about, and the refusal, and I used earlier the term from Gore Vidal, living in the United States of amnesia. All the major books on the New York Times bestselling all about history, but it's history from a particular point. It's about Bill O'Reilly trying to tell us about what really happened with Lincoln and so on and so forth. Bless his heart. And so there is a hunger for history, but accept those histories from beneath, those histories that say we have a grittier, conception of what the truth is about, a genealogy that doesn't comport well with a kind of self-identity of whiteness that wants to remain innocent. At what point, Joshua, do we say it's that whiteness is not unsolvable? It's not something that can't be undone. We don't have the will to do so. That's what I meant by H.L. Mencken. He said it's not that we've tried Christianity to fail. We never tried it. We've never tried the real, if you will, dispensation of grace that could be applied to black people when it came to systemic injustice. As Khalid just said, we had affirmative action for how long? And then it was attacked. Then it was assaulted. Then it was piecemealed. Even Bill Clinton said, mend it, don't end it. So there are all of these complications and consternations around it, but we've never tried a basic thing called for by your understanding of original sin. Repent. Where is the repentance of America?
We don't disagree.
Where is the acknowledgement that what we have done is wrong and we must do something to correct what we've done? When you call us neoliberals, I'll take this. The neoliberal argument is about the retelling of racial remedy based upon, forms and cells of entrepreneurship. So we could say DEI was part of the problem. Well, white women got in on that. If you call it a boondoggle, they were the head of it. If you talk about affirmative action, they were the head of that.
White gay men also.
I mean, big time, and other able people. When you put it together, black people were not the major beneficiaries of it materially, but symbolically, they have carried the weight of the stigma associated with these projects. This is another ledger domain of whiteness to throw rocks and hide hands and not be held to account.
And back to Bell, right? So like even affirmative action broadly framed, white women were the primary beneficiaries.
Yeah. I totally agree on that. That's a big problem.
No, it is. I do agree in some respect. I want to take this conversation to this angle, but the way in which left-oriented identity politics has been deployed by specific segments, I find to be highly problematic. And this whole notion of like collective guilt that is being doled on to white men and white women, I find to be problematic. Back to Michael's point, this notion of collective guilt has always been assigned to black and brown and Muslim bodies, and still is today, with regard to conversations around criminality, terrorism, illegality, mass incarceration, exactly. But it only becomes an issue, collective guilt, that is, when it's finally being assigned to white folk.
Right.
Like, why has it been an issue? Why has it not been an issue over these last 25 years of the war on terror Patriot Act, countering violent radicalization, anti-loitering policies, anti-gang policies in predominantly Black communities, the way in which ICE is now moving into Latinx communities like my own where I live in Arizona. Why isn't this notion of collective guilt being ascribed to Black and brown bodies a principal issue for the right when it's being weaponized against non-white bodies? But it becomes like this huge issue of concern when it's finally being assigned to white folk. That's what I see within this broader discourse that I think is one that needs to be ferreted out.
Well, Khaled, to move us further, a little bit further along, I'm really curious to what you have to say to Joshua's point that identity politics has created a sense of impotence where people feel like they're trapped in these categories, but that doesn't actually lead to a sense of collective action. Would you agree with that?
And so, in some ways, I definitely do. I mean, even in my work, right, as a consequence of the things that I write about and who I am in the world, you feel as if this sort of like intellectual or existential confinement is assigned to you in ways that really stifles your ability to speak freely on issues that you care about, right? Or in dissident ways, in ways in which I might sort of like veer away from the groupthink on the left or amongst critical race theorists. And I have in many ways. I mean, for instance, speaking up on Gaza as openly as I have within legal academia, has, brought about a lot of sort of, ostracization, even within leftist progressive spaces who have been sort of like silenced as a consequence of staunch Zionist pressures within legal academia. Right. But I think there is a concern where identity politics, can be a straitjacket.
But see, here's the point, and to Joshua's point as well. The problem with the wholesale repudiation of a politics of identity that never comes out the closet, to use a queer analogy, among white folk, is that it disregards the internal machinations of dissent in these minoritized and leftist communities. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of argument. There's a lot of wrangling about what's the appropriate way. A lot of fracture. There's the great disdain in some segments for the very cancel culture about what you speak. I'm calling it that, right? And the ways in which you can't automatically just disown people. And the best approach, for instance, when the young man who was, I think it was like a 17-year-old white guy who was quoting some rap lyrics and used the N-word, all right? That's different than you standing up on the street corner calling me the N-word. If you're quoting now, I would say that ain't nobody really innocent at this point. You should be using the word. But let's just say he's a kid. He's 17 years old. He apologizes, right? He apologizes. He says, I'm sorry. It's not like he was like defiant. Like, I don't care. I heard that in rap music. Y'all shouldn't, if y'all don't want me to use it, don't you? He didn't do that. He apologized. He got his 4-year scholarship taken from him.
Yeah.
Then
That's not right.
Then a Black school, Black coach is like, wait a minute, this is a 4-star quarterback? Let me wait a minute, bro.
He saw an opportunity.
Let me open my mind and receive his, apology, and then deploy him on my field of battle. He was going to give this guy a scholarship. The community got hold of it, and the kid got denied. I think that's horrible.
Yeah.
I think that is not who we are at our best. If people now, there are instances where people have been defiant and offensive without apology. God bless them. But when a kid says, I'm wrong, not the kids that our vice president talks about, some horrendous forms of racial animus that were expressed by 35-year-olds, right? We're talking about literally a teenager who made a mistake, who has no space to be redeemed, no space in the culture to say, I'm sorry. And we're now in a gotcha moment where now we're waiting. The trigger warning is that we're going to announce to people these words being deployed will somehow lead to your being incarcerated symbolically. Or when I was in class teaching a class on Kendrick Lamar, and, my TA said, well, Dr. Dyson, it's about police brutality.
What's your favorite album is?
I would say Good Kid, Mad City.
Okay.
That's one. And then the one after, what's the one that he got all of the, not the one he got the Pulitzer for, damn.
To Pimp a Butterfly?
To Pimp a Butterfly was because he has Tupac weaved throughout. But I'm a Drake man. Don't hate me.
Really?
Oh, yeah. See what I'm saying? See, Joshua? I'm a Drake man.
You can do
Trust me,
both.
I'm in the minority right here, right? And I'll tell you why. Because to me, Not Like Us is the most white supremacist Manichaean distinction between us and them that demonizes the other, that reduces blackness to Compton and not the global understanding that Drake coming from Toronto and using different identities of blackness that they are unfamiliar with and therefore they are illegitimate. But anyway, back to my point.
I would love to keep having this
All right,
conversation
but-
because I'm deeply
Let me say
engaged
this one thing
in the
about
Drake
I didn't
Kendrick
predict
beef.
this is
Okay, this is what I said. So I'm in the Kendrick class, and it's the video where he used the cop is not a real gun, but he's using a gun, and my TA says, "Dr. Dyson, do you think we ought to issue a trigger warning?" I said, "Yeah, okay. Look, this is a video about police brutality. The cop has a gun. The gun got a trigger. He gonna pull it. Show the video." So, right? Like, look, a lot of us are through with the fastidious attention to narcissism masked as rigorous commitment to revolution and resistance. Come on, bro. So but I'm saying we don't understand that there is this kind of argument, this vital disquisition, this vital dispensation of difference that's being distributed among ourselves. And we're arguing in ways that because we're being painted by one brush, we never get acknowledged for the kind of nuance and the complexity that we can bear.
I think this is a good moment to try and drive ourselves home a little bit. And I find it so fascinating that so many of these words, redemption, repentance, original sin, keep getting invoked again and again in how we talk about this issue. And Joshua, if you can take us forward where you think this movement is going. You called it an incomplete religion. Does that mean that there's a way to complete it? Or do we have to give up on this religion? Do we have to become agnostic or atheistic to it and then return to something else that was there before?
And invite me back when you do the Drake versus Kendrick. I want to be in.
You're first on my
list.
list.
All right, thank you, bro. That's a serious discussion we have to have.
I think there's three ways forward here.
He's a good preacher. He's a good preacher, man.
3 points. And I'm talking now about the Christian West. Okay. So I think we either have wave after wave of these incomplete religions where the pure and the stained are painted with very broad brushes, but it's made very clear. So in the French Revolution, it was the universal rights of man versus the church, the aristocracy. With Marxism, the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, they're the oppressor and the oppressed. Post-colonial studies, I think identity politics does this with the language of invoking the language of whiteness. I think that this is a 250-year movement. They've had different iterations, and there's three possibilities. Either we're going to have wave after wave of these incomplete religions, none of which, in my view, actually solve problems. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm agreeing with many of the problems. I just think that the language of identity politics, where you sort out who's pure and who's stained, that's no way to solve it. So either we're going to have a continuation of this identity politics or this incomplete religions, or you're going to have more and more of the Nietzschean option, which is the alt-right, which is we don't care. And I don't want that. I've been fighting about it in print. My view as a Christian in the West is the incomplete religions make a promise of thinking through redemption of the world, but ultimately it ends up destroying half the people who are the impure ones. And so I think that the categories of redemption have to be returned to the church fully so that we can solve the problem of staying there, so that we can get on to solving the actual problems that we're all agreeing exist through political means rather than theological means. We are living not in a post-religious moment. We're living in a post-political moment where everything is now an incomplete religion. So three options. Either Christianity finds its mojo again, and we think in terms of redemption, in terms of the church, et cetera, and then we can do politics, or we do incomplete religions as politics, and French Revolution, communism, identity politics is that. Or finally, people get so disgusted and fed up, which is the Nietzschean option, and we just say, we're done with the category of guilt altogether. Michael, to your point, I don't want to get rid of the category of guilt. I want a full accounting so that there can be a Christian way of solving this. But the identity politics way will never solve it.
Khaled, what do you think? Are there either of these options?
Yeah.
Do you think is the way that we're going, first of all, but also is the way that we should be going?
Well, look, this whole idea of Christianity or bust doesn't sit well with me, and the centering of Christianity as being the sort of final and only.
That's what I said in the West,
Well,
because this comes from the West.
Even in the West, right? When we talk about specifically the United States and the way in which our First Amendment is set up is denial of the establishment of one religion and centering of one religion. So the centering of Christianity is inimical to the constitutional project. And I think this needs to be, sort of added to the conversation if we take separation of church seriously, right? So I'm a Muslim. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Detroit. If you go to places like Dearborn or parts of Detroit or Philadelphia or Camden or Minnesota, Minneapolis, I would offer the alternative of religious pluralism, right? This whole notion that individuals have the right to freely exercise their faith in ways that they see fit, whether it's through, the sort of structure of organized religion, or if it's agnosticism or new religion as being sort of solutions, but or new sort of prisms in which they can sort of organize and see themselves and organize their communities. But if the only solution in sort of construction of American identity and salvation is to be sort of anchored in Christianity, I think that's problematic because it sort of perpetuates the sort of cycle that if you're not this, then you are not first class. If you are not that, then you are essentially a marginal or a sideline segment of this community. So I think, as somebody who teaches constitutional law and teaches the First Amendment, that this country should sort of break away from the tradition of seeing one religion as being the sort of, endorsed religion of the state and move towards this aspiration of being a religiously pluralistic society.
Michael, unfortunately, we have limited time, although there are so many branches of this conversation we can go in. But to give the final word to you, talking about identity politics, which you have defended, talking about religion and religiosity, do you see them as being walking hand in hand towards a path towards justice, or are they in conflict with one another? Do we need to pick one route or the other?
Well, let me advance my Hegelian synthetic moment here. We can baptize Nietzsche. We can get something out of him. I mean, we got to do something with Nietzsche. The writing is too beautiful, and we can't give him over to Wagner and then over to Hitler. So the thing is that, thank God, and I mean this literally, that a certain variety, a genus and species, if we look at the relationship of Christian identity, has not been permitted to eviscerate my standing as a human being, as a citizen, and as a member of the church writ large. So for me, given what Khaled just said, and I can identify with what Joshua was saying in terms of the West and religious discourse, and specifically Christian discourse, but I have found it to be an enemy of my humanity. That white Christian nationalism has undercut me. White Christian nationalism has not said, as a fellow Christian, let me join with you to figure out a way beyond the impasse imposed upon us by arbitrary or contingent barriers that we must now together remove. No, it has deferred to whiteness as the ultimate option in its own moral discourse. The quiver is full of arrows, but they are all pointed at me, not in my defense. So I believe at that point, what Khaled has said, that the Disestablishment Clause is a gift from God. No religion shall be established as formal and institutionalized from the American government. Therefore, they all can flourish. If Tim Tebow bows on the ground and prays to God, he is celebrated. If a Muslim does that and prays to Allah, he is seen as an enemy of the state. So I believe ultimately that we must together work toward the belief and what Josh was talking about, that there can be transformation. Dearborn, Michigan. When I was a kid, I'm 67, so I'm the second oldest here. Joshua wins the title.
Once again,
He
please
looks
give
good.
me your skincare routine after this.
But check this out. When I was a kid, Dearborn, Michigan was a terror.
Mhm.
The mayor, Mr. Hubbard, used the N-word unapologetically and unrepentantly in that office.
And then 20 years later, 25 years later, 30 years later, now we're talking about people of Arab descent or Middle Eastern orientation or Chaldeans who are in Dearborn, Michigan, who have relationships, and not all great relationships, tensions between African American and Chaldeans. We had those tremendous tensions. But after 9/11, I think that there was a shift in understanding, and those Chaldeans were called sand N-words. Here's my point. There is evolution and change possible. And there is the possibility that we can redeem each other by holding each other to account. And the only way we can do that is to not establish our religion formally as the vehicle through which that occurs.
Yeah, I agree.
Personally, and Martin Luther King Jr. didn't want the church and state to be obscured and the barriers between them denied, but he believed in God to the ultimate degree. We can believe in God as the motivation for participating in a language that is universal, that includes everybody, that allows all peoples, religions, orientations, sections, and divisions to come together under a language that respects the integrity of our individuality and yet confers upon us a value in our collective spirit. I think in that sense, religion at its best is about understanding how human beings can have a cosmic connection to human beings who are unlike them, but who are children of God nonetheless. And if we believe all human beings are children of God, we have a better chance than believing my way is the only way.
And I think that's a really great universal message to take from this discussion, because, a lot of this centers around America grappling with itself, and this,
Yes.
this is a fight that's still alive. We also have a global audience, and I wonder, Khaled, what you think they can take away from this conversation today.
Oh, a lot. I mean, a lot of concern that I think I'm very pessimistic about the future of the United States with its rifts racially and religiously and these culture wars that are taking place. But I think broadly speaking, if you decenter Christianity from the conversation, you see that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, but also globally in many ways. That I think it's critical for the world to sort of unlock seeing itself in the mirror opposite image of the West, right? And to build a sort of like indigenous sort of separation in ways that, can promote pride, can promote self-determination, can promote, ideas for state building and society building that are not centered to the West and not centered to Christianity. And I think you're seeing that in some regards with some of the movements that you made mention of earlier. And I think that's one primary takeaway that I'd highlight.
And Joshua, is there a universal takeaway from this message, this conversation, that you think we can end on?
So my caution is the one I raised before, which is I do see this identity politics language as emerging out of Christianity. And, having taught in the Middle East for the better part of 15 years, the thing that really does surprise me is young Muslims who want to recover an authentic Islam. But I find I listen to them and I hear echoes of Rousseau, of Marx, of Nietzsche, of postmodernism. And my view is a healthy Islam, I'm confirming what you're saying, that a healthy Islam is going to have to draw on indigenous resources. And my worry is that the West has so penetrated the Muslim world, especially with identity politics, that in fact you're doing harm to your attempt to find your own voice by invoking these categories that are essentially Christian.
And I want to thank you, Joshua Mitchell, for being here today, Khaled Beydoun, Michael Eric Dyson. This has been a fascinating conversation. We are going to come back and talk about Drake and Kendrick at some point, I hope.
Yes, let's do that. Let's
I
do
hope
that.
the
That's
good
the
folks
real
at Doha debate.
division. That's the real division in the world. Drake or Kendrick? Which one are you?
Absolutely.
All right.
I'm not going to say who I am, but...
Oh my goodness.
but
You look like a Drake guy.
Huh?
You know.
Listen, man, we were getting along.
That's on a diss.
I mean,
See?
I guess I gave myself away a little bit there.
You
I
want to
wanna-
make me join Joshua. Okay.
I want to thank the three of you for your rigorous spirit, your intellectual rigor, and the passion that you brought to this conversation. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this. I know you have a lot to say about this conversation as well, whether it's identity politics, religiosity, redemption,
Drake
original
said
sin.
jealousy is just love and hate at the same time. Just remember that, okay?
I mean, we might, I don't know if we want to end on with the Drake quote, but let's here we are now.
Kendrick said, "Ain't nobody praying for me."
Kendrick said, I ain't black, don't call me no more.
There we go.
That's your That's your guy.
Joshua,
A
do you
black
have
guy?
any music lyrics that you wanted to
No,
you
I'm
want to
staying out
represent?
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Let's give him some love.
There we
okay?
go. There we go. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and this is the Doha Debates podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.